A couple of weeks ago, YouTube suggested that I watch this video expose by a YouTuber called Angel Mason, who somehow is some kind of cartoonist or illustrator about everything about superhero is gay and at the same time a manifestation of toxic masculinity. So the main premise of Manson is that classic superhero tropes are really gay superhero tropes. For example, the way that superhero dress in colorful costumes is really a drag queen show. The secret identity is the way that gays express themselves as they come out of the closet. So the secret identity of superheroes is somewhat akin to coming out of the closet, revealing yourself to other people, keeping a secret. A lot of the arguments that Manson makes is trying to find what what he would call the queer aspect of superheroes, while at the same time dumping on comics and accusing comics and superheroes of being at the same time an expression of toxic masculinity. She's saying that they're staying in the closet and they're using all those gay tropes while trying to play a game of toxic masculinity and hating on women. I wrote a long commentary, but I guess I'm not part of the crowd that Manson usually writes and produces video for. I've gotten no response, I guess. Maybe because a lot of my arguments were a bit too truthful. And at first, when I saw the recommendation from YouTube, I was intrigued and I said, yeah, wow, let's go listen to that. There might be something interesting. I have zero problems with looking at superheroes as gay metaphors. I mean, this is what the X-Men have been doing since the 2000s, and that was one of the arguments I wrote in my response to him. Bryan Singer, when he decided he was going to direct the X-Men films, the specific orientation that he picked was coming out process and the gay identity of specifically mutants in the Marvel universe. You could see that in the scene with Iceman, Bobby Drake declaring to his parent that he's a mutant. It really is a coming out scene, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. I have zero problems with that. But a lot of the arguments that Manson was making was that everything about superheroes is about being gay, and that every sign of violence is about toxic masculinity, while at the same time dumping on comics, which he says he hasn't read, he's never read, but dumping on them. So some of my arguments were that, he doesn't understand comics, and specifically not superhero comics, especially since he's very proud of saying he doesn't read them. Now I know he's from the younger generation, and a lot of them think that they know everything about superheroes because they've watched the MCU for the last 15 years. They think they know everything about superheroes, about Captain America, about Spider-Man, Superman, Batman, because they've seen a couple of movies, they've watched a couple of cartoon shows, like they watched Justice League, they've watched the Teen Titan, a couple of Marvel shows, they've watched Black Panther, and they think that they know everything that there is to know about the superhero as featured in those films and those cartoons and TV shows. The thing is that if you're a comic book reader, you know that most of those shows barely capture maybe 20% of the entire dimension of what those characters are. There's so much more lore and complexities, new continuities, revisionism, retcons. There's so many things involved. Those characters evolve. They're not the same characters that we read in the 80s, the 90s, the 70s, the 60s, the 50s, and so on. They're not the same characters. They've changed over time, and how they were presented originally in the original Golden Age comics has changed too. And a lot of that history seems to be annoying to that kind of commentator that just dismiss comics. They would look at a Phantom comic strip and say, okay, he's a guy wearing purple and blue and black trunks. He's obviously a drag queen. Forgetting the fact that, and this is one of my arguments, that no, the colorful costumes that superhero wore, Superman started this, not Superman, the Phantom did it first. Those costumes were inspired by circus performers, not by drag queens, not at all. In fact, there were drag queens in the past, but they probably weren't as flamboyant or as visible in society as the local circus performers, who did capture a lot of people's attention and imagination. This is what inspired the way superhero dress. The circus performer's suit. It was about being a freak. It wasn't about being a man in skin-tight costume trying to pass for a woman. That's not the point, because also the women also wore those costumes too. They certainly weren't trying to pass as men or anything else than circus performers performing extraordinary feats. And those costumes, which he likes to say are camp and tacky and so on. While in the 1930s and 1940s, they weren't really tacky. That's what circus performers wore. Sure, it was a bit different than what regular people wore, but at the same time, the colors were used to identify characters. For example, if you were a villain, you would wear probably green and purple and orange. If you're a hero, most times you would wear something like yellow, blue, and red, primary colors. There's a lot of that in play with the original superheroes. And mind you, color was not seen as something camp back then. Just a few decades before, you would recall that pink was a color assigned to men and blue was a color assigned to women. Now, there was a reversal just before the war, but still, those colors, those color-coded colors, were not assigned to one gender before that. So when he says that everything was drag, he's a bit wrong, because part of the experience of being drag also, I guess, not an expert at all, but drags do wear hats and feathers and so on. It's not just about the colorful costume. There's other apparel that they wear on top of that. You could say the cape is part of that, but it would probably be more like something furry, like some kind of fur coat or a scarf or something like that. That's not what the superhero wore back then. It was always skin-tight costumes, which is quite different than a drag queen, which is a man wearing a costume that makes him look like a woman. One of the main problems that I've got with his essay is that everything he does is using what we call, when you look at history, there's a term called historiography, and he's using today's sensibilities, today's lens, to look at how people did things in the past. And this is wrong. You cannot use today's standard to evaluate something in the past, because that's not what they were trying to get at. So when he's saying something like that superheroes were created with secret identities that they were hiding, it's because they were hiding something like their sexuality and so on. He completely misses the boat here. The original focus of the secret identity was based on the fact that a lot of the creators of those early comic strips, comic book superheroes, were Jewish, and they were trying to pass as Gentile, to mix in Gentile society. That means non-Jewish society, or Anglo-Saxon, or Protestant. They were trying to pass, to be acceptable in those societies, to hide their Jewishness, which is a classic trope that Superman is really the history of Moses. You can't take away from that. It's weird when people try to assign things like, okay, no, superheroes were created by creators that were in the closet and they were just trying to express the gender identity, the secret gender identity of characters as being gay. No, they were Jewish creators trying to create characters that would pass off as being Anglo-Saxon, as being WASP. That's what it was about. And he talks a lot about Frederick Wortham, whose book put a spotlight on a lot of comics at the time, saying that they were improper for kids. But the sequence of events that he describes actually happened after, in the sense of what Wortham said about comics, happened after the argument that he made. So in terms of continuity, like, it doesn't make sense. He's saying that Wortham did something which therefore transformed the superhero into XYZ. No. The superhero was like that. Wortham wrote an article, wrote a book, saying that the superhero were such and such, and that's got people to respond to that, not the other way around. One of the main flaws of his entire essay is that he skips Wonder Woman and other female superheroine. He just doesn't use them. We know that Wonder Woman was a made-to-order character created to attract a female readership, that she was created to be a strong female character, that her creator had sensibilities with lesbians and a lot of that LGBT culture. So a lot of who Wonder Woman was when she was initially created was about undertones of lesbianism, femininity, and feminism. She's a feminist character. Even though she's not the first superheroine, she became a standard of what a female superheroine could be. A lot of his essay completely misses the boat about Wonder Woman. He likes to focus on what he calls toxic masculinity, but toxic masculinity did not exist back then. A lot of the terms that people in critical political circles. That means that they're basically using, well, often Marxism, or in this case, in the case of this creator, something akin to what we would call cultural studies. A favorite term of people in those circles is a social construction. Now, they obviously missed the mark on what a social construction is. And well, it's been happening for decades that social construct and social constructions are not what the original authors of that book wrote about. And I don't want to go into pure academic mode here. I'm very familiar with the original book about social construction, and another book that criticized what social construction is, The Social Construction of What. Classic book I always assign to my graduate students to read. I make them read both books and figure it out for themselves. It's obviously very difficult for them to figure it out, but excellent books for that. So what he calls toxic masculinity is what I would call a social construction. It is looking at a phenomena and labeling it as is. Now, toxic masculinity, if you're using what we call realist approaches, does not really exist in nature. It is something that people come to, something that people identify, something that people say exists. There's nothing wrong with that. But when you use something like toxic masculinity and say that comics in the past were all toxic masculine, well, you're reaching here, because at the time, there was no concept of toxic masculinity in the 1940s when most of those superheroes were created. So you cannot use the lens, today's lens, to analyze something back then. You can't do that. Well, you can, but that's flawed research. That's flawed commentary, because if the society was not the same, and a lot of what he perceived as superheroes trying to save the world, performing feats of and adventuring, is really him not understanding that back then the heroic figure was chivalrous, noble, honest, and so on. They were not incels overcompensating for personal flaws. They weren't would-be alphas or sigmas or anything like that. That has nothing to do with those characters from the 1930s, the 1940s. This is something actually, toxic masculinity, alpha, sigmas, and all that incel crap and so on, snowflakes and all that crap, is something that started in the 2010 to the present. You cannot use that lens of analysis and say everything back then was about alpha male and betas and sigmas and incels and snowflakes. No, there were no snowflakes back then. This is something that, well, a social construct that has happened in the 2010s. So you can't use that lens and say everything back then was toxic masculinity, because it wasn't. Those heroes were heroic, adventurous, because that's how the stories were shaped. They reflected their time. Now, characters from comics have evolved since. They've incorporated a lot of flaws, especially Marvel characters in the 1960s. They're not perfect characters anymore, and we see this all the time. But to call them toxic masculine is a flawed analysis, and it's wrong. It's also a cheap shot against comics, where you're trying to put some stuff that did not exist, that wasn't even a contentious back then. One of the things that he says in that essay that is kind of funny is that he completely misses the boat about the real portrayal of queer characters in comics back then and in popular media back then. Now, it's not the most complimentary portrayal of queer people. I'm not saying that it was complimentary or very positive, but that's the way that a lot of queer characters were presented in such media back then. And I'm talking about villains. If you look at your Disney villains, Scar in The Lion King, he's got this queerness to him. Captain Hook in Peter Pan also has a queer flavor to him. If you look at villains like Lex Luthor, and especially the way Lex Luthor was presented in the James Gunn film just a month ago, there's a lot of queer sensibilities to him, including the colors those characters used. Purple, green. Those colors back then might have been associated with queer, probably more than blue, yellow, and red. Those were secondary colors. They weren't the main colors. So the hero often had, not always, primary colors. I mean, Green Lantern wore all kinds of colors. But the villains often had secondary colors. And a lot of them look shady, skinny, and maybe even effeminate or flamboyant. And this is where you can find queer identity in old comics. You can criticize that, and of course the portrayal of those characters as coded as being queer was negative, of course, but that's what we can look at older comics. That's what we can find when we look at the source material. We can see that those characters were often queer coded, not just villains but also sidekicks. I'm not speaking about sidekicks like Robin. I'm speaking like commoners, like civilian sidekicks, like Dorby Dorbles and other sidekicks, like the sidekick from Wildcat, the superhero Wildcat. Often skinny characters or a bit fat character, non-conforming in terms of not heroic figures in a sense. Often those characters had queer coded inside of them. With Wonder Woman, Etta James or Etta Jones was coded as a lesbian in that sense. But obviously, Manson did not mention that. Well, he wouldn't be because he's not familiar with that. And if he was, he would probably push it aside because it's not a complimentary portrayal of LGBT communities in comics back then. If there is a criticism, that's the one he should be making. That comics, cartoons, TV shows, film at the time coded queer characters, funny characters, or villains or sidekicks as queer. Now that's a valid criticism to make about those old media, because if you go back in time, that was the real intent. We'll make this character, we'll code him as being queer, as being gay or LGBT, to say that he's an evil character or he's a special character. He's not the hero. Now, that is not toxic masculinity at all. But this is how queer characters did appear in comics. They didn't hide their identities. They didn't hide who they were. They didn't mention it. They didn't mention that some of them were queer, some of them were not queer. But they didn't mention it. But it was pretty clear that they were. So in that sense, they were not in the closet. But obviously, that perspective is not a positive one for the LGBT community. But if you want to look back at historical comics, that's what you need to do. You need to bring that out too. This is my response to Angel Manson. And I wish he would do more research and probably read the source material before he writes or produces those grand essays. He obviously does not know comics. He knows a little snippet of stuff that he's seen on TV and films and cartoons. And he thinks he knows a lot, but he doesn't know much. And he's using today's sensibilities to analyze a media that is over 100 years in some case, or close to 100 years. And that doesn't work. That doesn't cut it. It's not serious work. And it's also dumping on comics once again, something which really pisses me off when people do that, because comics is a medium. You can put whatever you want in it. And just dumping on the medium and saying that it's all about toxic masculinity means that he doesn't get comics at all. It's so much more complicated. There's comics about everything. That a snippet of comics were, according to him, toxic masculine, even though back then it was not a thing. It's a weird type of essays. This is Hervé from Comic Book Bin. Fill you in since 2002. Like and subscribe.